Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Milwaukee on the night of May 27, 1991 was thick with the promise of summer. Memorial Day had just passed, a day of parades and barbecues, of remembering the fallen. But on North 25th Street, a struggling artery in a neglected part of the city, the air was cut by a different kind of tension. It began with a figure, small and unsteady, stumbling into the intersection of 25th and State. He was naked, his slender frame shivering despite the mild air. He was bleeding from his rectum, and a thin trail of saliva trickled from his mouth. He was incoherent, mumbling sounds that held no shape, his eyes vacant and unseeing. He was just a boy, 14 years old. His name was Canaric Synthasomphone. 3 young black women, Nicole Childress, Sandra Smith, and Tina Spivey, were returning home when they saw him. They saw his distress, his youth, his utter vulnerability. They did what any citizen, what any human being is supposed to do. They called for help. They dialed 911. While they waited, they approached the boy, trying to comfort him, to shield his nakedness from the passing cars. They tried to understand the garbled sounds he was making, but it was impossible. He seemed drugged, lost, terrified. As they stood with him, a man emerged from the nearby Oxford apartments. He was a white man, 31 years old, with neat blondish hair and a calm, almost placid demeanor. He walked toward them with a casual authority. He told the women that the boy was 19, that his name was John, and that he was his adult lover. He was just drunk, the man explained. They'd had a fight. He put a familiar arm around the boy and began leading him back towards the faded brick facade of the apartment building. The women knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The boy was far too small, his face too young, to be 19. His fear, even in his stupor, was palpable. They protested, positioning themselves between the man and the boy, telling him to leave the child alone. An argument erupted. It was at this precise moment that the system arrived. A Milwaukee police cruiser, responding to their 911 call about an abandoned, naked child, pulled to the curb. From it stepped officers John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish. The scene they encountered was, on its surface, a messy, low-level urban disturbance, a domestic dispute, but the details were screaming. A naked, bleeding Asian teenager who could not speak for himself. A slightly older white man claiming, with unnerving calm, that it was a lover's spat, and 3 black women, frantic and insistent, telling the officers that the boy was a child, that he was hurt, that he needed help, that the man was lying. The system had a choice to make. It could listen to the women, whose instincts were sharp with genuine human concern. It could look closely at the boy, see the terror behind the vacant stare, and call for the medical evaluation he so clearly needed. It could question the man's story, which was a little too smooth, a little too convenient, or it could take the path of least resistance, the path worn smooth by years of prejudice and assumption. The officers spoke to the white man. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. He was articulate, polite, and cooperative. He told them the boy was his lover, that he was 19, and that he had a little too much to drink. He invited them into his apartment to prove the boy lived there. Inside apartment 213, the officers were met with a truly horrific odor, a smell so foul it should have stopped them in their tracks. Dahmer explained it away as a result of a broken freezer full of spoiled meat. They saw a box of muriatic acid on the floor. In the bedroom, sitting on a nightstand, was a stack of Polaroid photographs, face down. Had one of the officers turned that stack over, the entire slaughter would have ended that night. But they didn't. Dahmer showed them some wallet-sized photos of an adult Asian man claiming it was his lover. The officers bought it. Their entire interaction was colored by a casual, corrosive prejudice. They were recorded on their dispatch radio, laughing. One of them made a joke about needing to be deloused after dealing with a gay couple. They dismissed the passionate concerns of the three women on the street as the meddling of nosy neighbors. One of the women, Sandra Smith, pleaded with them. "But he's just a boy," Officer Gabrish reportedly replied. "It's a boyfriend-boyfriend thing. He's 19. It's an adult consensual thing." They determined this was a domestic issue, a private matter. They walked Coneric Synthasum Phone, who was by now practically catatonic, back into the hell of apartment 213. They helped Dahmer guide the limp boy onto the foul-smelling bed. They told the women on the street who were still protesting to mind their own business. Then they marked the call as resolved, and drove away. Behind that door, within the hour, Jeffrey Dahmer would drill a hole into Coneric Synthasum Phone's skull and pour hydrochloric acid into his brain. He would then dismember his body, the 14th of 17 victims he would ultimately claim. The police did not fail because they lacked a smoking gun. They failed because they refused to even look for one. They failed because they saw a situation not as it was, but through the distorted lens of their own biases. They saw a gay spat, not a predator and his prey. They heard a calm white man, not the frantic, truthful pleas of black women. They saw a nuisance to be cleared, not a child in mortal danger. They stood at the very threshold of a human abattoir, and, after a cursory glance, decided it was none of their business. Today, we are not here to simply recount the ghoulish catalogue of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. The world knows what he did. Instead, we are here to perform an autopsy on the circumstances that allowed him to do it. This is not the story of an evil genius who outwitted a brilliant police force. It is the story of a deeply disturbed, but ultimately unremarkable, man who killed with impunity because he operated within the blind spots of a broken system. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a failed system, a system that, through a lethal cocktail of racism, homophobia, and sheer institutional indifference, effectively held the door open for a monster. To understand how the system failed so spectacularly on that May night in 1991, we must first understand the man it failed to see. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960, a child of the suburban dream. His father, Lionel, was a brilliant and driven research chemist, a man of science and rigid order. His mother, Joyce, was a teletype machine instructor, a woman described as emotional, needy, and plagued by severe depression and anxiety. On the surface, it was a typical mid-century American family. But beneath the placid exterior of their home in Doylestown, Ohio, the foundation was perpetually crumbling. Lionel was a doctoral student, often absent, buried in his work, and emotionally distant. He viewed the world through a scientific lens, and had little patience for the emotional chaos that seemed to envelop his wife, Joyce, who had suffered from mental health issues prior to Jeffrey's birth, became increasingly dependent on her son for the emotional support her husband could not or would not provide. She was, by many accounts, both smothering and neglectful, vacillating between intense anxious affection and long periods of depressive withdrawal. The marriage was a cold war of passive aggression and simmering resentment that frequently erupted into volatile, screaming arguments. Young Jeffrey was the silent witness to this domestic strife, a quiet, anxious child who began to retreat from a world that seemed unpredictable and hostile. He was, by all accounts, a normal and energetic child in his earliest years. But two things happened that seemed to accelerate his withdrawal. First, he underwent a double hernia operation at the age of 4, an experience he later said instilled in him a feeling of vulnerability and detachment from his own body. Second was the birth of his brother, David, when Jeffrey was 6. The new baby demanded Joyce's attention, leaving Jeffrey feeling displaced and abandoned. He grew more withdrawn, isolated, and disconnected from his peers. The first clear sign of his dark fixation emerged from the woods around his home. He became obsessed with animal bones. It began with a fascination for what was inside things. He would collect roadkill, squirrels, cats, dogs, and carry them into the woods. He built a small hut behind the house that became his private laboratory. There, he would dissect the animals, examining their internal organs, fascinated by how they were put together. To his father, a man of science, this was perhaps an unusual hobby, but not necessarily an alarming one. Lionel even tried to engage with his son on a scientific level, showing him how to safely bleach the bones to preserve them. But for Jeffrey, this was never about biology. It was about control. It was about possession. In death, these creatures were perfectly still, perfectly compliant. They couldn't leave him. They couldn't argue. They couldn't disappoint him. They were his. As adolescence began, this internal world of fantasy and control curdled. He began to feel intense homosexual urges that terrified and shamed him. In the conservative, hyper-masculine environment of 1970s Ohio, these feelings were a source of profound alienation. He was a loner at Revere High School, a socially awkward outcast known for pulling strange, attention-seeking pranks. He would fake epileptic fits in the hallways, make spastic movements, and bleat like a sheep. A small group of boys formed a mock Dahmer fan club, encouraging his bizarre behavior for their own amusement, unknowingly reinforcing his role as the freak. He was there, but he was never really seen. His primary coping mechanism became alcohol. He began drinking heavily in his early teens, smuggling beer and liquor into school, hiding it in his locker. Alcohol became his crutch, a way to numb the social anxiety, the shame of his sexuality, and the increasingly disturbing violent fantasies that were beginning to coalesce in his mind. He fantasized about dominating a beautiful young man, of having complete control over another person. The fantasy evolved. He wanted to keep them with him forever, even if it meant rendering them a mindless zombie or a corpse. The desire was not for a partner, but for a permanent, unabandoning possession. The final fracture of his family life occurred just after his high school graduation in 1978. After years of bitterness, Joyce and Lionel filed for divorce. The process was ugly. Joyce took Jeffrey's younger brother, David, and abruptly moved out of state. Lionel moved into a motel. For 3 months, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer lived completely alone in the family home. The external structures that had, however imperfectly, contained him were now gone. He was adrift in a sea of alcohol and his own escalating fantasies, the fear of abandonment now a concrete reality. It was during this period of intense isolation that the fantasy bled into reality. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after he graduated, Dahmer was driving his parents' car when he spotted a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was 19, on his way to a rock concert. Dahmer offered him a ride, then lured him back to the empty house with the promise of beer and marijuana. They drank, listened to music, and for a while it seemed like a casual, if awkward, encounter. But when Hicks said he had to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. The primal fear of being abandoned, the core trauma of his life, overwhelmed him. He did not want Hicks to go. He couldn't let him go. As Hicks turned to leave, Dahmer grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell from the living room and struck him from behind. He then strangled him with the bar. For the first time, he had acted out his ultimate fantasy. The aftermath was a grim parody of his childhood hobby. He dragged Hicks's body into the crawlspace. He later dissected it, performing the same grisly rituals he had previously reserved for animals. He attempted to dissolve the flesh in acid and smashed the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering the fragments in the woods behind the house. He had his first permanent, compliant companion. The system had no way of knowing about Stephen Hicks. He was simply a missing person. But this first kill established the blueprint for everything that would follow. It was an act born of a desperate pathological need to prevent abandonment, a need that could only be satisfied through total and ultimately lethal control. Shortly after the murder, Lionel Dahmer, now remarried, forced Jeffrey to enroll in Ohio State University. It was a predictable disaster. Jeffrey attended classes for just one semester, his life consumed by a crippling alcohol addiction. He flunked out. Lionel, at his wits' end, then pressured his son to join the army, hoping the discipline would straighten him out. In late 1978, Dahmer enlisted and was trained as a medical specialist, ironically learning skills in anatomy that he would later put to horrific use. He was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, but his alcoholism only worsened. He was often drunk on duty, unable to perform his tasks. After 2 years of poor performance, he was honorably discharged for his drinking problem. The military, another system meant to instill order, had chewed him up and spit him out. In 1981, he was sent to live with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee. For a time, it seemed like a stable environment. Catherine was a kind, church-going woman who loved her grandson, though she was deeply troubled by his heavy drinking, his inability to hold a job, and his habit of bringing young men home late at night. The system began to brush up against him here, but only glancingly. Neighbors complained about foul smells coming from the garage. Catherine herself found a mannequin in his closet that disturbed her. She would sometimes wake up to the sound of him in the basement at all hours, but these were dismissed as the eccentricities of a troubled young man. Beneath the floorboards of his grandmother's quiet suburban home, however, the horror was beginning again. In 1987, 9 long years after he killed Stephen Hicks, Dahmer struck again. He met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a bar in Milwaukee. The details of that night are hazy, even in Dahmer's own confession. He claimed he blacked out from drinking and woke up the next morning in his hotel room, with Twomey's dead body beside him. He had no memory of killing him, but knew he was responsible. In a panic, he bought a large suitcase, stuffed the body inside, and took it back to his grandmother's house in a taxi. He dismembered it in the basement. The killings now began to accelerate. He murdered James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, and Anthony Sears over the next 2 years, all men he met at gay bars or bus stops. He would lure them back to his grandmother's house with promises of money or drinks, drug their beverages with sleeping pills, and then strangle them. He would then engage in acts of necrophilia and dismember the bodies, sometimes keeping parts of them, like skulls or genitals, as trophies. He was perfecting his ritual, driven by the same pathological need for control and possession. And here, the system had its first real, undeniable chance to stop him. It wasn't a 911 call about a strange smell. It was a criminal charge with a child victim. In September 1988, Dahmer lured a 13-year-old Laotian boy, Sinchai Synthasym phone, to his apartment. He drugged and sexually assaulted the boy. When Sinchai awoke, he was groggy and his pants were down. He managed to stumble out of the apartment and into the street where he and his family reported the crime to the police. Dahmer was arrested. The charge was second-degree sexual assault. The evidence was clear. He confessed. This was the moment. The system had him. A confessed child molester, already on probation for a separate indecent exposure charge, from 1986 at the Wisconsin State Fair. The logical outcome should have been a significant prison sentence, but the wheels of justice turned in a strange and catastrophic direction. Dahmer presented himself as a remorseful, troubled young man struggling with his sexuality and alcoholism. His character witnesses spoke of him as quiet and respectful. His lawyer argued for leniency, emphasizing his lack of a prior felony record. And the judge, William Gardner, agreed. In his sentencing, Judge Gardner seemed more concerned with Dahmer's rehabilitation than with public safety. The pre-sentencing report noted Dahmer was acutely aware of his sexual preference difficulties. The judge, looking at the clean-cut, seemingly contrite man before him, spoke of Dahmer as a bright young man who had a lot of potential. He noted Dahmer's steady employment at the Milwaukee Ambrosia chocolate factory. He saw a man who seemed to be on the right track, who had simply made a terrible mistake. He sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to just 1 year in a work release program, meaning he spent his nights in a correctional facility, but was free to go to his job during the day. He served only 10 months before being released on probation for 5 years. The system did not just fail, it actively endorsed the facade Dahmer presented. It looked at a white, polite, employed man and saw redeemable potential, not a predator. It failed to see the profound danger he posed, even after he had confessed to drugging and assaulting a child. The probation officer assigned to his case later noted that Dahmer seemed to be a model parolee. He checked in on time. He passed his drug and alcohol tests. He was quiet. There were no red flags. But the model parolee was simply a more careful killer. And the name of his victim, Sinchai Synthasomphone, is crucial. He was the older brother of Kanarek Synthasomphone, the 14-year-old boy that officers Balcerzik and Gabrish would hand back to Dahmer less than 2 years later. The system had already been formally introduced to the Synthasomphone family's suffering at the hands of Jeffrey Dahmer. It had documented it, processed it, and then, with a stunning lack of foresight, effectively dismissed it. This lenient sentence wasn't just a mistake. It was a green light. It taught Dahmer that he could get away with it, that his clean-cut, unassuming appearance was a form of camouflage, that the system was unwilling or unable to see through. Freed from any meaningful consequences, he was ready to escalate, and for that, he would need a place of his own, a place where no one would look too closely. In late 1988, while still on probation for assaulting a child, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street. His grandmother had finally asked him to leave, tired of the late-night visitors and the foul odors. The move marked a new, far more prolific chapter in his reign of terror. The Oxford Apartments were not just a location, they were an essential component of the systemic failure that allowed him to flourish. The building was located in a predominantly black, low-income neighborhood. It was a transient place, where people came and went, where neighbors often kept to themselves, and where the police were seen more as an occupying force than a source of help. It was, in short, a place where a quiet white man could go largely unnoticed, and where the complaints of his neighbors would carry little weight with the authorities. Dahmer had found the perfect hunting ground, and the perfect laboratory, for his grisly experiments. The list of victims from this period is a heartbreaking roll call of the marginalized. Most were men of color, black, Latino, or Asian. Many were gay. They were young men like 23-year-old Raymond Smith, a father of 3, who went by the name Ricky Beeks, 31-year-old Edward Smith, who was hearing impaired, 22-year-old Ernest Miller, a talented dancer who was about to start college, and 25-year-old David Thomas, who had just moved to Milwaukee for a better life. Dahmer would meet them in bars, at bus stops, or on the street. He would offer them money for posing for photos, or simply invite them back to his apartment for a drink. The pattern was always the same. He would drug them with sleeping pills dissolved in their drinks, and once they were unconscious, he would strangle them. Apartment 213 became an abattoir. The sounds of power tools, particularly a drill, echoed through the building at all hours of the night. A constant putrid smell, a chemical rotting odor, seeped from under his door and through the ventilation system, choking the residents of the building. The neighbors complained repeatedly. One resident, Glenda Cleveland, who lived in an adjacent building, but whose niece, Sandra Smith, lived in the Oxford apartments, became the de facto voice of their concern. She was a persistent, courageous woman who knew something was terribly wrong. She called the police. She called the building manager. She called the FBI. She described the smell, the sounds, the strange young men who would go into apartment 213 and never be seen again. Her calls, and the calls of other residents, were systematically ignored or dismissed. The building manager told them there was nothing he could do. The police would occasionally respond, but they rarely took the complaints seriously. When they did knock on Dahmer's door, he was always ready with a plausible excuse. The smell was from spoiled pork chops, or a backed-up sewage line, or chemicals he used for his hobby of preserving animal skulls. He was calm, articulate, and non-threatening. To the police, he was a quirky but harmless resident. The complaints from his black neighbors were treated as a nuisance, the typical friction of low-income apartment living. This is a critical element of the system's failure. The police did not see the residents of the Oxford apartments as credible witnesses. Their concerns were filtered through a prism of racial and class bias. Would the same repeated calls about drilling sounds and a smell of death from a resident in a wealthy white suburb have been so easily dismissed? It's highly unlikely. In this neighborhood, however, the system was conditioned to ignore such calls. Dahmer wasn't hiding his activities. He was merely conducting them in a place where no one with power was willing to look. He grew bolder. He began experimenting with methods to create his perfect, compliant zombie. He would drill holes into his victims' skulls while they were still alive, but heavily sedated, injecting acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to destroy their will but keep their bodies alive. The experiments always failed, resulting in the victim's death. The corpses would then be dismembered in his bathtub. He would boil the flesh off the bones, keeping the skulls and skeletons. He ate parts of his victims, believing it would make them a permanent part of him. He stored heads and hearts in his refrigerator and freezer. He kept a large blue 57-gallon drum in his apartment, filled with acid, where he would dissolve the remains. The evidence of his crimes was not hidden in a secret cellar. It was right there, in a small one-bedroom apartment. The smell alone should have triggered a massive investigation. The sheer volume of missing persons reports piling up, all young men of color, last seen in the vicinity of the gay bars Dahmer frequented, should have been connected, but the dots were never joined. The Milwaukee Police Department at the time had a notoriously poor relationship with the city's LGBTQ+ community. Gay men were often seen as unreliable victims or participants in a high-risk lifestyle. Reports of their disappearances were not prioritized. The idea that a serial killer was specifically targeting this community was not something the police force was culturally equipped or willing to consider. So Dahmer operated with near total impunity. He was a ghost, hidden in plain sight, protected by a shield of societal indifference. The system that was supposed to protect citizens like Ernest Miller and David Thomas failed to even acknowledge their existence was in peril. It ignored the frantic calls of neighbors like Glenda Cleveland. And in May of 1991, when that system came face-to-face with undeniable proof of his evil, it chose to look the other way, leading us back to Canerek's synthasum phone. The end for Jeffrey Dahmer came not from a brilliant piece of detective work or a system finally waking up to its failures. It came from the sheer will to survive of one man. On the humid night of July 22, 1991, 2 months after police returned Canerek to his death, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards met Dahmer at a bar. Dahmer and 2 other men approached Edwards, offering him $100 to come back to Dahmer's apartment, drink some beer, and pose for nude photographs. Edwards, needing the money, agreed. Once inside apartment 213, Edwards was immediately struck by the overpowering stench of chemicals and decay. The apartment was strangely bare, except for a fish tank, a rollaway bed, and the large blue plastic drum in the corner. As Dahmer handed him a beer, Edwards' unease grew. Dahmer's demeanor shifted. He became menacing. He led Edwards into the bedroom, where he suddenly snapped a handcuff onto one of Edwards' wrists. Dahmer then pulled out a large butcher knife and told him he was going to watch a movie, gesturing towards a VCR. The movie was The Exorcist III. Dahmer became agitated, chanting and rocking back and forth. He forced Edwards to kneel, pressing the cold steel of the knife to his chest. He told him he was going to eat his heart. In that moment, staring into the flat, dead eyes of his captor, Tracy Edwards knew he was going to die. He began to talk, to try and reason with Dahmer, to look for any opportunity. He played along, feigning compliance. He waited. After what felt like an eternity, as Dahmer was momentarily distracted, Edwards saw his chance. He told Dahmer he needed to use the bathroom. As Dahmer gestured with his head, Edwards stood up, and with a surge of adrenaline, he punched Dahmer hard. Knocking him off balance, he bolted for the front door. It was secured with 2 separate deadbolts. As Dahmer scrambled after him, Edwards fumbled with the locks, the handcuff clanking against the door. He managed to get them both undone, and burst out into the hallway, and then into the street. He ran, the handcuff still dangling from his wrist, until he was able to flag down a police car. The officers who responded were Rolf Muller and Robert Routh. They listened to Edwards' frantic, almost unbelievable story. A freak had pulled a knife on him and handcuffed him in his apartment. The officers were skeptical, but protocol dictated they investigate. They accompanied Edwards back to the Oxford apartments and knocked on the door of 213. When Dahmer answered, he was once again calm and cooperative. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a kinky encounter that had gone wrong. But this time the officers insisted on entering the apartment to retrieve the key for the handcuffs. As Officer Routh stood with Dahmer and Edwards in the living room, Officer Muller walked into the bedroom. He saw a large butcher knife on the bed. Then he opened the drawer of the nightstand to look for the key. He didn't find a key. He found a collection of dozens of Polaroid photographs. The pictures were graphic and horrifying, documenting the dismemberment, decapitation, and violation of human bodies. They were photographs of Dahmer's victims, posed in death. Muller, stunned, walked out of the bedroom, holding one of the photos, and showed it to his partner. "These are real," he said. As Dahmer realized what they had found, he lunged, but the officers quickly subdued him. He was arrested, and apartment 213 was finally sealed as a crime scene. What the police found inside was a house of horrors that exceeded their worst imaginings. It was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. There were 4 severed heads in the refrigerator. A human heart was in the freezer. There were 2 skulls in a box and 3 more in a filing cabinet. The 57-gallon blue drum contained 3 human torsos dissolving in a chemical sludge. Skeletons were found in his closet, along with preserved organs and genitals. The full scale of the systemic failure that had allowed this to happen was now laid bare in the most grotesque way imaginable. The fallout was immediate and immense. As the details of the case emerged, the city of Milwaukee was engulfed in a firestorm of outrage, shame, and grief. The families of the victims, who had spent months or even years searching for their missing loved ones, were now confronted with the horrifying truth. Their grief was compounded by the searing anger that their sons, brothers, and fathers had been ignored, their disappearances dismissed, because of who they were and where they lived. The focus of this public fury quickly fell upon the Milwaukee Police Department. The story of Canaric synthasum phone became a national symbol of police incompetence and prejudice. The 911 tapes and the dispatch recordings were released to the public, and the office's callous jokes sparked widespread condemnation. Protesters, led by community activists and the victims' families, marched on police headquarters and City Hall for days, demanding accountability. They chanted the names of the dead, accusing the police and city leadership of racism and homophobia. Jesse Jackson came to Milwaukee, declaring the city a national capital of shame. He argued that Dahmer was not an isolated monster, but a product of a society that devalues the lives of minorities and gay people. For the Black and LGBTQ+ communities in Milwaukee, the Dahmer case was not a surprise, but rather the most horrific confirmation of their long-held belief that the system was not designed to protect them. In response to the public outcry, an investigation was launched. Officers John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish, along with another officer involved, were fired by the police chief. It seemed like a moment of accountability. However, the story doesn't end there. The police union defended the officers, arguing they had simply made a mistake in a confusing situation. After a lengthy appeals process, an arbitrator overturned their firings. In 1994, Balcerzik and Gabrish were reinstated to the force with full back pay. John Balcerzik would even go on to be elected president of the Milwaukee Police Union. The system, after a brief moment of public shaming, had closed ranks and protected its own. Dahmer, meanwhile, had readily confessed to everything. In over 60 hours of taped interviews with detectives Patrick Kennedy and Dennis Murphy, he provided a calm, chillingly detailed account of his crimes, describing his methods and motives without any apparent remorse. He spoke of his overwhelming loneliness and his fear of abandonment, explaining that killing his victims was the only way he could ensure they would never leave him. His trial in 1992 was not about guilt or innocence. That was never in question. It was about sanity. The defense argued that Dahmer was legally insane, driven by an irresistible impulse stemming from a mental illness, necrophilia. The prosecution argued that while he was undoubtedly sick, he was not insane under the narrow definition of the law. They pointed to the careful, methodical way he planned his crimes, buying sleeping pills and acid, luring his victims, and meticulously concealing the evidence. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He simply chose to do it anyway. The trial became a spectacle, featuring graphic testimony and the competing opinions of psychiatric experts. But the most powerful moments came from the families of the victims, in a raw, visceral explosion of grief and rage during the victim impact statements. Rita Isbell, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay, screamed at Dahmer in court, "Jeffrey, I hate you. This is how you feel," she yelled, her body heaving with sobs as she was restrained by deputies. It was a moment of pure human anguish, a piercing cry against the cold, procedural nature of the trial and the detached demeanor of the man who had destroyed her family. The jury agreed with the prosecution. They found Jeffrey Dahmer to be legally sane. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, later increased to 16. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. His life in prison was short. On November 28, 1994, less than 3 years after his conviction, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. He was 34 years old. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is often remembered for its gruesome details. The cannibalism, the dismemberment, the attempts to create human zombies. It's easy to focus on the man, to categorize him as a singular, once-in-a-generation monster, an aberration of nature. And in doing so, we miss the most terrifying lesson of all. Dahmer's evil was not exceptional in its genius, but in the mundane opportunities it was afforded. He was a socially awkward, alcoholic predator who operated in full view of a society that was structured to ignore him and his victims. The true anatomy of this case is not found in the dissection of Dahmer's mind, but in the dissection of the system that failed to stop him. It was a failure at every conceivable level. It was a judicial system that gave a confessed child molester a slap on the wrist, deeming him a bright young man. It was a probationary system that mistook his quiet deception for rehabilitation. It was a police department whose institutional culture of racism and homophobia blinded its officers to the truth, even when they were standing in it. It was a society that had created neighborhoods of neglect, places where the cries for help from marginalized people were allowed to echo into silence. The police did not just return Conarak's synthasum phone to his killer. They confirmed to Dahmer what he already suspected, that the lives of the men he preyed upon did not matter, that the concerns of the people in his neighborhood did not matter, that as long as he maintained his placid, non-threatening facade, he was effectively invisible. He was able to build a charnel house in a residential apartment building, not because he was a brilliant criminal, but because the system had already deemed the area and the people within it as disposable. The ultimate horror of Jeffrey Dahmer is not what he did, but what we allowed him to do. It's the chilling recognition that the monsters among us do not always thrive in the shadows. Sometimes they thrive in the blinding glare of our own indifference. The true horror found in apartment 213 was not just the dismembered bodies of his victims, but the reflected image of a society that had already carved them up by prejudice, dismembered them by neglect, and discarded their humanity long before Jeffrey Dahmer ever laid a hand on them. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.